Welcome everybody to this edition of Beers with Bill. It's my great pleasure to invite myself tonight. So we're going to do an advanced Scotch class, and so what I want to do is walk you a bit of the information from the first class to start with. You know, as I said in the first class, what you do is you take your Scotch and you put a drop of water in it. The action of the water hitting the Scotch pulls the esters and oils into the middle and drops them and binds them up, so that you get the underlying aroma and flavors coming through. You remember that I said that Scotch is crafted for 3 very essential tastes plus the aroma. So you take the, I've got the Sovereign here to start with. I'm only using these little shot glasses because that's what I was used to in my classes. You get a hint of floral in there, get some sweetness coming through. And you get a hint of vanilla, and then we're going to talk about that in a second, so you understand a little bit more as you take a second breath of that. So the crafted, first of all, you take the bouquet or the aroma, smell it, see what it smells like, and then this is number 1, yes, the Sovereign. And I'm going to show, so the Sovereign in the bottle is that color, and the 228 from Tullibardine, as you can see, is much darker, because that's the influence of the Burgundy barrel aging that happens with it. So I'm going to talk, if you remember what I said about the fact that if you didn't put a drop of water in, the first effect that you would get would be the grass tones, which all happen in your upper chest. That's where you feel them. Burning sensation that happens there. You put the drop of water in, it brings out the underlying aroma and flavor. The first one being peach, apricot, raspberry, strawberry, which happen around your teeth. Peach, apricot in front of your teeth, raspberry, strawberry behind your teeth. And then the next thing that's the fruit tones. And then our body recognizes bean tones. First bean tone is hazelnut. The second one is vanilla. They're almost the same. If you take the aroma of the Sovereign a second time, and just before you stop breathing, pay attention to the fact that that aroma is hitting just behind your teeth up in the roof of your mouth. And I'm going to take my first sip of that. You remember what I said? You just need a drop, count to 10 before you swallow. That allows all the pheromones and alcohol to evaporate in your mouth. Fill your mouth and your nasal cavity across 3 sips so you get the full effect of the taste. First thing you're going to notice is it's really, really sweet. If you like peaches, you're going to feel it in front of your teeth. If you like strawberry, raspberry, you're going to feel it right behind your teeth. A total sensation. Now, when you take that second sip in a couple of seconds, pay attention to just as you're swallowing where the sensation starts to happen. And this time you're going to start noticing there's a little bit of a sensation in the roof of your mouth, about a finger width back from your teeth. That's where our body experiences the flavor of vanilla and the flavor of hazelnut. Hazelnut's just a tiny fraction in front of it. Vanilla is really close. The next thing that our body recognizes is milk chocolate in bean tones. And that's a sensation that happens along the edges of your tongue. If you take the third Scotch right now and take a deep breath of it, just take the aroma. And in the middle of your breath, you're going to feel the sensation along the edges of your tongue. And that is how you feel the sensation of milk chocolate. Sweetness, the sweetness of milk, the bitterness of chocolate makes it give you that sensation of being in the forward half of your mouth. I'm now going to take a third sip of the first Scotch. The floral is coming through as a sweetness, the vanilla is coming through, and then you get the barley, the hint. It's still, all the flavors are in the front half of your mouth, but that backward feeling and sensation that's happening on your tongue up to the top of the roof of your mouth is a sensation. They call it sweet barley in Scotland. It's the sweetness of barley versus the bitterness of oats and wheat. Because barley is a little higher sugar content, a lot more sweeter when you distill it. So you get the tickling sensation from milk chocolate. Then there's a bridging sensation from either side up to dead center roof of your mouth, but not dead center. That is cocoa, the sensation of cocoa. And then in the dead center roof, or I should say what we would call chocolate. I call it cocoa, but chocolate. Very little sweetness, but not the dead center roof of your mouth, which you experience as Dutch cocoa, which has all the fat removed, and it is straight bitterness from the cocoa bean. Finger width back of that is where you experience dark roast coffee. So we're going to go down a dead center line in the roof of your mouth. So dead center roof of your mouth. Now we're going to go back towards your throat, dead center. You can experience sensation of coffee. 2/3 of the way back, you experience espresso. And what I'm talking about is real Italian espresso, not the stuff that Starbucks make that's just really sugary sweet. Real espresso is 2/3 of the way back. And then if you've ever had the luck and experience of having somebody make you real coffee, and they call it Turkish coffee, where literally it's a little thing on the stove and they're tapping it and the things and they pour it in a demi-tasse and it's just a puddle of caffeine in the bottom of it. That is right where your throat and your roof of your mouth meet. That is absolute total bitterness right there. The last thing that our body recognizes are what you call earth tones. We talked about that, the smoke tones, which happen right at the top of your throat. The damp earth tones that happen right here. Damp earth as opposed to barnyard smell. Damp earth is the smell of moist soil when you turn it for the first time versus what a barnyard smells like. And then the very last thing is musk. They're liking it. You worked out, you sweated like crazy, you left your socks in the gym bag, and the next time you open it 2 weeks later, that horrible smell is musk, and it sits right exactly where you have the first experience. So it's almost a closed loop from the sensation of grain tones to the last tone our body recognizes. So now that you've had the 3 sips of the first Scotch, the Sovereign from Tullibardine, I'd like to go to the 228. Now the 228 is the exact same Scotch, except that the last 12 months, it spends in a Burgundy 228 liter wine cask. And so if you take the aroma in your nose, you breathe it in, and you can actually smell the Burgundy wine. Now, I'd like you to take a second aroma smell, because very, very faintly, when you stop breathing, is a tone I want you to pick out, and it's spiciness, and it's actually, and I got to look at it because I have it in my notes here. Allspice. So I had to find where I wrote it down. So take a second one, take a really deep breath, breathe in. Just when you stop, you'll smell that spiciness. So this one, I want you to take your first sip, get a drop on your tongue, count to 10, and then swallow. You've got a very similar sweetness to begin with. But then the spiciness starts to roll in, and it goes, it's there's a subset of taste and flavor, which is caramel and toffee. Caramel and toffee, caramel layers across your tongue and toffee layers just above your tongue. Depending on which flavor you like best, whether you like fresh toffee, or fresh caramel, or you like toffee that's been made and sat for a while, that's how you're going to experience this. So for those of you, it's right along your tongue, that is fresh caramel. Now, because I want to talk a little bit about that, my great-great-grandfather worked for Roundtree as a chocolatier, and he was like the number 3 guy, which is why he came to Canada, because he was never going to be the number 2 or number 1 guy. And I have his recipe books from making making chocolates in Roundtree. And he talks about making caramel and toffee, and the difference is 1/2 degree Celsius when you cook it and 30 seconds longer. So when you're making caramel, you don't burn the sugar, because caramel is basically sugar that you liquefy the sugar by heating it up. But if you cook it for 1/2 degree Celsius more, and he was using Celsius because he was taught by a French guy how to do it, and for 30 seconds longer. So you just slightly burn the sugar, and the difference between toffee and caramel is toffee is slightly burnt. And so if you think about having fresh caramel, the 3 tones that your body will pick up is the sweetness of strawberry, the sensation of dark milk chocolate, which is the bridging effect in the roof of your mouth, and smoke. And the smoke is faint enough that you don't recognize it as smoke, but those 3 things combined flatten everything on top of your tongue. And because toffee is slightly more cooked, so it's burnt a little bit more, there's a little more aroma of smoke in it, it lifts it off your tongue. I'm going to take a second sip of that second Scotch. Now this time, you're going to start feeling the sensation of milk chocolate along the edges of your tongue, along with the caramel. And you're going to start picking up the smoke tone at the very back. You might mistake it for dark roast, Turkish coffee, but it's actually in your throat when you pay attention to where you're feeling it. And it's a slight hint of smoke. It is very, very, very mild. So your body's not going to pick it up quite as much. There's another thing in there. We're going to get it when we take that third sip in a couple seconds, which is red fruit, and that's what they call cherry. And there's a slight hint of, so the sweetness changes from being the sweetness of milk chocolate. And originally, if you remember, the sweetness was more like strawberry. It was more towards the front of your mouth, not towards the back. But now, as you're filling your mouth cavity up and your nasal cavity with the pheromones, it changes. We're going to take a third sip of that one now. Just as you swallow, the sensation of cherry comes through. Now, I want you to think about what happened when you swallowed. When you swallowed, the sweetness was not at the front of your mouth, and it wasn't along the edges of your tongue. It was almost like a ball over the top of your tongue, about 1.5 fingers back from the roof of your mouth. And if you think about eating a red cherry, really fresh red cherry, that's exactly the sensation that your body gets when you're eating it. There's the mouthfeel of the cherry and the crunchiness of the outer skin and the flesh, but when you pay attention to what it tastes like, now that's they call it red fruit. I call it cherry, because over there in Scotland they don't refer to things like cherry and peach. They talk about stone fruits. So there's orange stone fruits, yellow stone fruits, and red stone fruits. We're going to talk about the finish afterwards. So what we're going to talk about is the aroma, the initial impact, which is the first sensation that we got. And we're going to do that when we move to the third one, is the initial impact, the palate. What happens when you first taste it? We've walked through that with this one already. And then the body of the Scotch, which is what's happening right now. And you know that that's still lingering inside your mouth. There's still the sensation of caramel. There's still the sensation of milk chocolate. There's still very, very at the back at the beginning of your throat is that sensation of smoke, which you don't feel as, you don't recognize it as smoke, but that is what's causing that sensation back there. Yeah. So the third Scotch we're going to do is the Isle of, that's what happens when they do it. The Isle of Arran, the Crenza Reserve. This is the first Scotch that the Isle of Arran distillery ever made. The Isle of Arran is just off the coast by Glasgow on an island, and it's surrounded by land at the very top. There's a peninsula that comes out, so it's actually surrounded by land, and it's only about 3 miles from shore. So the distillery is considered to be part of, it's not part of Islay, which is only 20 kilometers away. It is considered part of the Highland region as it transitions into the lowlands. So Tullibardine is a highland, Isle of Arran is a highland, and Glenfiddich 18 that we're going to do is a highland. Anyways, we're going to take the aroma of this first. Fresh green apples and lemon. It's very faint, it's very light. We're going to take the first sip of this one now. And if you're sitting there before you swallow, the lemon comes through immediately on your tongue. And then when you swallow, you get the sensation of a green apple. So what you're getting is sweetness and tartness combined, because a green apple has a little bit of sweetness like an apple, but it's very, very tart because it's green. The next thing that happens on your palate is you're getting a hint of milk chocolate again, because it's along the edges. The Highland region, all of these scotches that we're doing today have spent time in bourbon, first use bourbon barrels. So you're getting all of the sweet tones from bourbon, which are hazelnut, vanilla, milk chocolate, and milk chocolate and then dark chocolate versus cocoa. When you take the second sip of the scotch, which we're going to do, I want you to pay attention right after you swallow. There's a slight brininess that comes through. Everything has now moved from the front of your mouth to almost the 2/3 of the way back. But if you pay attention, it's slightly salty. And now that you've done that, I'd like you to take the nose of it again. I want you to take a really deep breath and pay attention. You may or may not get it because I don't know if it got lost in the transfer, but there's a slight hint of iodine to the aroma. It smells a little bit like a hospital used to smell 30 years ago, when iodine was the #1 thing they used to sterilize everything. And that comes from the angel's air, the angel share of the air. We'll talk about that a little bit later when I get into the finishes. Notice that there's a slight hint of toffiness now that we've been sitting here. It's not on your tongue, it's slightly above your tongue. So you could have these 3 scotches that we just had, and the first thing in your brain would tell you, if you were a Scotch aficionado, if it was a blind taste test, these are all Highland region scotches. The reason that they're Highland region scotches is on the east side of Scotland, and I forgot that, should have looked up my notes, the river valley, that's the second region there. They do a lot of floral tones in their scotches. In the Highland region of Scotland, they don't have to deal with salt air. And so they spend a lot of time pulling out the bourbon barrel flavors, which are the ones that we're currently talking about. These are all related to bourbon barrel flavors. I'm going to take the third sip of this one now. Best way to describe the flavor at this point is to go, this is really creamy right now. It's no longer at the back of your mouth. It's no longer at the front of your mouth. It's not just on your tongue. It's that creaminess that you get from Guinness, a well-made milk stout as well, creamy. Compared to the previous Scotch, the Tullibardine 228, this is dissipating fairly quickly on a finish. Now we're going to go back and we're going to do the finish and talk about each one. But this is moving through very, very, it's not a short and sweet finish, but it's not a long and drawn out finish. It's in that nebulous area in between those 2 points. Glenfiddich 18. This was and is the most expensive Scotch that we had at kickoff. It's almost $200 a barrel. I did a Glenfiddich class. I convinced Troy to just let me do it and not worry about it. We would make the money back at some point on that Scotch. So I can't even show it to you because I'm at the end of the barrel, but you can the bottle, but you can see how dark that is. It's a dark golden color. It's a little bit darker than the Tullibardine 228. And that's because you're now working on a Scotch that has sat in bourbon barrels for almost 18 years. It spends a short bit of time in single-use Oloroso barrels from Portugal. And so you're going to get that. I want you to take the nose of it right now. I get a tremendous amount of dried fruit on the aroma. However, some of you might smell baked apple, and some of you might actually be picking up the oak aroma from the Scotch because the amount of time it is spent in bourbon, you're starting to pull whatever tannins are left from the bourbon production. Andrea, fruitcake, absolutely. That's the perfect way to describe it because you're going to get that type of aroma in it. Let's take our first sip. I get date and candy peel, and candy peel being the candied fruit that you put in a fruit cake almost immediately. Tremendous amount of sweetness when it was just sitting on your tongue. And then when you swallowed, the date came through and then the candied fruit came through. And as you're sitting here right now, you're noticing that there's a slight sensation, roof of your mouth, 3/4, almost all the way back in the roof of your mouth, which is the beginnings, what you would call in wine, the beginning of oak. I'm going to take my second sip now. An absolute total different experience with it sitting on your tongue. There's no more sugary sweetness at the front tone. I'm getting a lot more oak. I'm starting to get what I would call a sensation of toffee, but it's not quite there. The beginnings of milk chocolate, which is the rising up on the outer edges of your tongue towards the roof of your mouth at the back. Milk chocolate along the edges of your tongue, but like I said, it's almost toffee, but it's not quite there. And it certainly is not caramel. Masters of Malt, which are guys that I tend to use a lot when I'm trying to figure out what flavors are, they describe that is the actual flavor of dried fruit, dried stone fruit. I'm not convinced that that's dried stone fruit, but then again, the other side of the coin, dried raisins, dried apricot, and dates all fall sort of in that realm of, it's almost toffee, but it's not quite there. So I'm going to take that third sip now. This is a very warm Scotch. This is what you would drink on a cold winter evening in front of a fireplace. This is the kind of Scotch that you would smoke with a full-bodied cigar if you were going to do that. I'm getting the oak full time. The milk chocolate. Bordering right on the edges of going to dark chocolate and bordering right on the edges of becoming toffee. If you take the aroma of this now, after you've filled your mouth cavity and nasal cavity up, you can smell the Oloroso in it. You know, it's I can literally, because I've had Oloroso, it's like you can taste it. It's got the full impact from the barrel of Oloroso. And that's because it spends only 6 months. And so the only thing it's pulling from the barrel is the aroma, is the flavor of Oloroso from the barrel. So 17 and a half years approximately in oak, bourbon oak barrels, and then 6 months in an Oloroso barrel. You imagine being the distiller master, because you get to test this all the time to see what it tastes like, and then decide this is the perfect spot to package this. So the 18 is a small batch. They make a batch for the 18 for full length, but they only do small portions of it in Oloroso. They hand select cask. They transfer them over to Oloroso for 6 months or whatever that squeezed in time period is, and then they immediately bottle it and they sell it. So the 18 is really hard to get, and it's also, that's the reason it's like $200 a barrel. You're getting a really finely crafted Scotch. So I want to go back to the first Scotch again. I want to do the 3 sips, and Derek, that's a great question. If you have, so we'll talk about that a little bit as I go through the finish, if that's okay, Derek. Most Scotches, if you drink them properly, should take you about an hour, hour and a half. But the Glenfiddich 18, if you do it properly, might take you 2.5 hours. And doing it properly is a discipline. This is what most people don't understand. We're going through a Scotch class, and I've got this like window of 45 minutes to walk you through everything. And so we're doing it quickly. You wouldn't pick your glass of Scotch up now until everything in your mouth is completely dissipated. Because Scotch is all about the flavor and the experience of the taste and flavor. It's not about consumption of alcohol. You know? And so if you remember what I said in the first class, if you watched an old English movie where the guy went to the gentleman's club and after dinner he smoked a cigar and he drank 2 fingers of Scotch in a rocks glass, and 4 hours disappeared, that's exactly how long it should take you to smoke a cigar properly and enjoy 2 ounces of Scotch, is 4 hours. So So we're going to go back to the first Scotch, the Sovereign, the Tullibardine. We're going to take the 3 sips. If you guys want to ask questions without writing them in the thing, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. So to answer the question you just threw up, Derek, if you were out at a bar that was a proper Scotch bar, you would either be buying 1 finger or 2 fingers of Scotch, 1 finger being an ounce in a rocks glass, 2 fingers being 2 ounces in a rocks glass. And you would immediately go, I'd like it neat, and I'd like a single drop of water. And if they look at you weird, you go, I'd like my Scotch neat, and please bring me a glass of water and put your own drop in, because it means that they don't actually understand what they're supposed to do.
And were each of these jars tonight an ounce or?
No, they were probably 3/4 of an ounce.
Okay, I was just wondering how much you put in.
Yeah.
So this should be like a 16-hour class. Is that worth your time?
That takes a lot of discipline to do it that way. I had a young gentleman once miss a class, and he actually listened to my instructions, and he was at the bar with that for 4.5 hours, sitting there enjoying the scotches because he really got it. But I think it was only because he was like, it was just him. And I was doing one of my favorite scotches, which is the Balvenie Doublewood. And the Balvenie Doublewood finish, the finish alone takes 20 to 25 minutes. So I've had my 3 sips of the Scotch now. Got that wonderful set of flavors, the floral, the sweet barley, the vanilla. You just sit there and pay attention to how it dissipates out of my mouth. And that's how it did. Now I want to talk a little bit because of, been jumping around a bunch of things. Angel share. The reason you can tell regionality is because when you set something in an oak barrel, and we talked about this the last time I was on the show, the graining difference between an American oak versus a European oak. American oaks are slower to maturity by almost 50 years. So the graining is denser than a European oak tree, which reaches this. So you're talking 150 to 175 years for an oak tree to reach maturity in America, but a European oak tree takes 100 to 125 years. The density of the graining changes because of that speed. So a European oak is much more open versus American oak is much tighter. So the American oak doesn't shed tannins as easily, but it also doesn't absorb bourbon. And because the rules say that bourbon can only be used in a barrel once, 90% of all bourbons, probably 95% of all bourbons are aged 2 years tops. You've got oak barrels that have lots of tannins in them, and the tannins are the ones that give you the bean tones. The longer you leave it in an oak barrel, the deeper the tannin tone becomes. So you move from having light vanilla flavor to having the deep Turkish coffee flavor at the back end, which is the expression of the oak at that point. European oak, they use it for the final. So Balvenie does it for 2 years for the Doublewood, but most of them it's 6 months to a year. The reason being is you move from losing 1.25% of the alcohol content every year to 1.5%, or it's not just alcohol, the alcohol in the water, 1.25% to 2.5%, twice as much in a European oak barrel. So you can imagine if you put it in a European oak barrel, you use 18 years and you're down to like 13% left because you're just losing so much over the course of that length of time. So they use it in a short time, but that's where they get the sweet tones, the peach, apricot, raspberry, strawberry, As you can see, the wine flavor, the Oloroso flavor, those all come through from the Angel Share. Now, I've been sitting here talking. Most of you will have noticed that the Sovereign has pretty well completely dissipated now. I've still got a little bit of sensational on the edges of my tongue and a little bit of the oakiness at the back, but that's it. The Sovereign would probably last for about 2 more minutes. It's sort of what you call a short and sweet finish. So I'd like to go to the 228 now. I'm going to take 3 sips of that while I continue to talk. So you can see, as a distiller master, you've got to think about where you're putting the barrel inside your building. And you have to think about, like, thinking about where you put it is because how often are you going to have to pull it out to taste it? The longer you leave it undisturbed, the better you are, but at the same time, you still have to take them out. And you have to think about the fact that they just put rows and rows and rows of barrels in a shed. It's not heated, it's not cooled, it's just whatever ambient temperatures are moving up and down. But if you have to get the barrel out from the back, you probably have to move 40 barrels to get to the one at the back. So there's this whole dialogue of, like, where are the barrels stored? Is it stored up at the top? Is it stored at the bottom? Is it stored further closer to a wall? Is it stored into the middle? Changes the dynamics of how much the air transfer, the Angel Share happens. But you'll also constantly be rotating them through. You might move a row out and switch them end for end. But what you have to take into mind is the predominant wind flow is west to east. So if you're on the island of Islay, there is nothing between you and Newfoundland. And when you go and stand beside the ocean, I'm going to take my second sip now. You go and stand beside the ocean, you take a really deep breath. If you were blindfolded, you would know you were standing beside the ocean, versus if you were blindfolded and standing beside a freshwater lake and you took a deep breath, you would know you were standing beside fresh water. And the difference is iodine. Salt water has a level of iodine that, although our body doesn't recognize it as iodine because it's not at a what you would call that a decipherable level that your body's going to go, oh, that's iodine. But your body knows that it's not fresh water because it picks up the aroma, but it's not there so that you recognize it. So 18 years on the Isle of Islay, if you were to open a bottle of Scotch that did not have a smoke component to it, the only aroma you would get is iodine after 18 years. I call it smells like a hospital because I remember what hospitals smelled like because when they used iodine for disinfectant. Most of you, it's a medicinal smell, but it smells like iodine. So the Islay region and the northern regions of the Scottish Islands, and there's a bunch of them, all have to put a smoke component into the scotches that they make. So the minute that you open a bottle that's smoky, you know that it comes from an island region in the northern part of Scotland. And that is called the Islay region, even though Islay is not the only island in that region. I'm going to take my third sip now. The Highland region, because you now have 2 things happening. One, most of the Highland region's distilleries are in the central part of Scotland. So you now have 300 kilometers of mountains and trees between you and the ocean, which cleans the air of the iodine aroma it picked up coming across the Atlantic. Plus, if you are in the Isle of Jura, the Isle of Arran, or the lower Highland region, it also comes across Ireland before it gets to Scotland. And there's only 20 kilometers of English Channel there's only 20 kilometers of channel between Ireland and Scotland. And so there's not enough time for it to pick up any iodine influence. So you don't have to worry about any of that. And you now can make a Scotch and let it express what the barrel tastes like without having to add smoke to it. And you can barrel age 50-year-old scotches that do not pick up an iodine or a medicinal tone. Then you get to the east side of Scotland. Now they have to deal with a bunch of different factors, including heavily mineralized water, which adds the same kind of component that you get when you make an IPA. There it is. I'm missing the word I'm looking for. It exemplifies the bitter things that you don't want to have happen in a Scotch. And so they tend to lean towards doing florals. So they tend to 2 years in any kind of barrel from Europe that's going to impart a sugary sweet flavor. That breaks the regions down. See, the northwest side of Scotland, the Islay region has to be smoky to get rid of iodine. The central part doesn't have to deal with anything, so they get to express everything perfectly. And when we get to the east side, you start dealing with the mineralized aspect of the water. And so you have someone who goes in the blind taste test, I can tell you approximately where the region is. And if you're really good, you can actually identify specific distilleries by the flavor profile that they express to begin with. That's not always true. That's at a level that even I wouldn't get to. That's someone who has tried every distillery in Scotland and has memorized them and got them figured out, because as you can see, the Tullibardine 228, it's got some of the flavors that the Sovereign does, which is their base Scotch, but it's quite different. The finish is still hanging on there. You're still getting a lot of that toffee flavor, a lot of that back end smoke that's not smoke, but it's still lingering back there. The sweetness that's on the edges of your tongue is still hanging on. And we're gonna, try and sit here for 5 more minutes, and that's about how much longer it takes. So now you're getting into a more drawn out finish experience. I'm gonna move to the third one though, but I'm gonna cleanse my palate with a little bit of water to start with. Isle of Arran, cheers. Feel free to ask any questions. At this time, I'm like, in a Scotch class, I have pretty well walked everybody through everything I need to walk them through. And I'm actually going from table to table and just answering individual questions.
I got a question, Bill. In terms of, it's okay, you've gone to the LCBO and you bought a bottle of 12-year-old Scotch. How long did it last on the shelf at kickoff typically?
I had
like a double wood. There was a lot of double wood you went through. Like
double wood. The double wood, I would go through a bottle of double wood every 6 months, if not every 3 months.
Right. So now the second part of my question is, Emma's stepmom, when they used to visit us, and they don't anymore because of her health. So one of the last times we anticipated a visit, it didn't happen. We bought a bottle of, she drank Glenfiddich, a 12-year-old Glenfiddich. But that could have been like 10 years ago, and that thing's still sitting in the basement. So now it's, what's happening to that Scotch?
So have you opened it?
Sorry?
Have you opened it?
No.
So the density of a cork in a Scotch bottle versus the density of the cork in a wine bottle is a good question, okay? Because that's what you're asking me.
Right.
What's the difference? So wine bottles use a less dense type of cork because they want it to breathe, because the actual oxidation factor of that bottle, and a wine bottle is always sitting on an angle so that the cork is always damp. You don't want it the other way where the cork doesn't have fluid against it. You're going to store it on an angle where the bottle actually keeps the wine closer to the front.
Right,
And that's because the bottle is going to breathe and it's going to oxidize. And the oxidation doesn't oxidize creating off flavors. What it does is it oxidizes the stronger forward flavors and mutes them, which is why you age a bottle of scotch, or I mean, a bottle of wine.
right,
Most bottles of wine that you buy, unless you know what you're doing, are actually to drink right now.
right.
Not all of them, but most. I put bottles in my cellar because it's like, I think this will over a few years create an interesting profile of flavors because of the oxidation. A bottle of scotch, you probably couldn't hear that, but the cork is much denser than the cork in a wine bottle. And that reason is it doesn't breathe. So as
At all.
long as you have not disturbed the cork in the bottle, you have kept it in a
Yep.
cool, dark location,
Yep,
and the cork remains moist, that bottle of scotch is the same as it was when they bottled it, whatever length of time it was back 10 or 12 years ago.
but if the bottle's been upright,
If the bottle's been upright, you run the risk that you might get the cork drying out,
let him try
but
that.
because it's a denser cork, it tends not to. It takes about 20, 25 years for that cork to dry out.
Try out.
That's pretty cool.
Now, once you open a bottle of scotch, you have approximately 2 to 4 years. At the 2-year mark, some of the flavors start to dissipate. You're experiencing bottles that I opened 3 years ago.
So these were
And as
bottles
you-
that were open at kickoff.
These are the bottles that were open at kickoff. So you see in the Tulip Bardine, all those flavors are still pretty well there. So for those of you who were like, while I was talking in the Isle of Arran, notice that the La Crenza is sort of short and sweet. It's gone. We're going to move over to the Glenfiddich 18.
This is what I'm still tasting. I don't know. I don't see anything.
But that's a really good question, Terry, because I don't know if I don't remember the name of it, but there's a Scotch place on Queen Street in Toronto in the Beaches area.
Yeah.
They were going over to Scotland in the 70s and 80s, buying bottles of scotch from distilleries that had gone bankrupt and throwing them in the cellar.
Wow.
And so you can go there and for an appropriately expensive price, try bottles of scotch that no longer exist. Because
That might be
the
40
distillery's
years
gone.
old.
Yeah.
It might be 40 years old or
Yeah.
been in the bottle for 40 years.
Yeah. Well, they were literally going in and buying cellars.
Wow.
They had enough money that they were going in it. And it was because the cellars were at the time that these guys were going under, you could buy the scotch for pennies on the dollar.
Right.
So they would go in and they would just buy them.
So here's what we learned about this. Glenfiddich has this metal stopper in it. Is that in any way possibly better than the original cork?
That's an interesting question.
Like it looks like a decent piece of machinery, but
If they've done the rubber seal properly, yes, it is. It's actually better than cork.
wow. Like it's got 3.
Well, 3, yeah, that gives you a much,
Yeah,
that
much
gives you
better
an
seal.
almost hermetic seal, which is what you want.
It's a pretty impressive piece of machinery. Emma's taking it from me now, and the scotch will disappear,
And you'll forget about it for another
and
10
I'll
years.
forget about it for another 10 years. When I retire, we'll drink it. That's interesting. So, but it's not like it's going to change. It's going to maintain.
It's going to
Best case
maintain,
scenario, it's going to taste like 12-year-old Glenfiddich when I open it.
yeah. Yeah. Now, we are doing all single malt scotches, which means they come from a single batch.
Right.
The difference between that and a blend,
This is
a blend is designed so the scotch tastes exactly the same anytime you have it, anywhere in the world. And there are people who are paid to craft them that way. So they will buy thousands of liters of scotches from other distilleries, bring them in-house, blend them to get the specific flavor. There's a whole science to it. I'm not a blended scotch drinker because I like the complexity of a single malt. It's a single batch. And I like the fact that it's not exactly 100% the same every time, because of course the variation in the weather across an 18-year period. They're close, but they're not always the same. But a Johnny Walker Blue Label will taste like a Johnny Walker Blue Label anytime you have it, anywhere in the world, because it's crafted to be that way. Andrea,
So-
do you have to answer? Sorry, Derry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to answer Andrea's question. She asked about the fact that they put a piece of the barrel in the bottle. Once you have hermetically sealed a Scotch bottle, nothing is going on inside the bottle. That to me is just a marketing ploy. And that is that you can get the effect of oak if that's the only thing you want by aging it in stainless and putting the oak inside, but you don't get the breathability that a barrel gives you. And that is the reason that the distilleries still, there's a few that don't, but the most of them still age everything in oak barrels in a building somewhere on their site. For those of you who have done the Glenfiddich 18, that flavor is lingering. I've been talking now for 5 minutes and it's still hanging in there. And it's going to take at least another 5 minutes for it to dissipate. So it's warm and it's long and drawn out.
Or in Emma's case, even longer, because she's still tasting it from when we did the first pass.
It's amazing.
She didn't do the finish on any of the rest of them.
I don't want to brush my teeth. I don't know. Anyway, it's amazing.
Well, hopefully you like that taste, because
Yeah,
if not, we're in trouble.
She likes it a lot. Is there a packaging date on Scotch?
Some do, some don't. Just like there's a trend right now in the industry with some of the newer distillers. So the distilleries that have been bought by somebody in the last, so say 1990 to 2005, there's a trend with a bunch of them to not put even a year, like a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old. They're treating Scotch like wine and they're going, this is when we're bottling it. It's ready to be bottled now. We're going to bottle it. Doesn't matter what year it is. They're gaming the system because some of them are doing single malts that are actually not single malts. They're blends of the same batch, i.e. that it was done the same, but it was done a day or a month or 6 months later and thrown into barrels. They're gaming the system and everyone knows that, but they're also consistently putting out great scotches. And so no one's going to go, you can't do that. So.
Because it's good Scotch and people like it and they don't really care if there was a number on the bottle.
No, and there's 4 of them and they elude me right now that started doing it and were very successful with it. Matter of fact, the first guy to do it took a distillery that literally was bankrupt in 1989, bought it, took them 5 years to figure out what they were doing, and they have never looked back since 2010. They every year are sold out.
I have another question. I feel like I'm asking too many questions.
Andrea's popped one up and then I'll get back to yours, okay?
Yeah.
So Andrea's asked, do different distilleries use native water or do they doctor it to keep that part consistent? I had a professor from the University of Guelph in my 3rd Scotch class who had this whole dialogue with me that he could tell where on what river the distillery was in a blind taste test by the impurities that were in the bottle of Scotch. And he's absolutely right until 1950 to 1955, when everybody went from using native water and finding out they could no longer do it because the water was polluted, to stripping everything out of the water and putting adjuncts back in it when they went to do same thing the breweries do. Literally make it distilled water, and then make it the water you want. And it's because if you look at the ownership of a lot of distilleries, Diageo owns 73. There's another group that owns 102 distilleries. They all operate independently, but they're owned by one corporation. And it's saved the distilling industry, so I can't say anything about it. But that was the big change, was they started making pure water to start with. So you strip everything out and then put in what they want to put in. So Terry, you had a question?
So it has to do with COVID. The Scotch that we've been buying and drinking through COVID was distilled 10 to 15 years ago.
Yep.
Did something happen in the distilleries? Like, so the brewers, everything fell apart and they had to repackage and do stuff. Will there be a COVID impact on Scotch?
18 years from now.
That's a good question. My first answer would be, and my first inclination would be no. And the reason is that if you take a look at 2016, 2017, so from about 2003, when I started doing Scotch classes, the best way to do it, 2003, when I started doing Scotch classes, to about 2013, the price of Scotch has never changed. It moved up and down a couple of bucks, but that basically I knew that I could go in and I could buy a bottle of Balvenie Doublewood for $76, and that's the price it would be. I could buy the Lagavulin Distillers Edition, which is a handcrafted 18-year-old Scotch that's fantastic. I knew that I could buy it for $103. From 2013 onward, the prices ratcheted up, and it's because China and Russia discovered Scotch. And the distilleries started selling out. And people were complaining, and I'm like, oh, you don't understand this. You have to make a decision today to put a Scotch down for 18 years. Think about how much money that is for 18 years, and you lose 37% of it at the end of 18 years. So when you get a new market and you have to react to it, it takes 18 years to react to it. And they look at me and they're like, oh shit, I never thought about that. And so is there going to be an impact from COVID? If there's an impact from COVID, it will probably be 18 years from now.
And if we all drank more during COVID, we can assume the Chinese drank more Scotch because they couldn't get out of their house for months at a time. If they could get Scotch, there might be this COVID echo 15 years from now where Scotch prices.
12, 15, 18 years from now is when you're actually going to see the impact of maybe they weren't able to actually run the distillery for a month.
Right, because they didn't have employees, they were off sick and they couldn't come in.
Yeah, or if they were running at half capacity, and we won't see that.
Right. Screw Bitcoin, buy Scotch.
So that was a question I was asked by one of the guys that frequented the bar a lot. I finished my PhD. What bottle of Scotch should I buy and put in my cellar so I can celebrate 30 years from now? And it was like, how much money do you want to spend? Because like, there's a conversation of nothing is going to change in that Scotch between now and 30 years from now if you store it properly. So what do you want? A last man standing Scotch kind of thing? And do you want to spend 1,000, 1,500, or do you want to spend 500 or 200? Because there's a big difference in what I'll recommend between those 2 points.
So that idea of buying a newborn infant a bottle of Scotch to open on their 21st
Or 40th.
or 40th or 25th wedding anniversary, whatever the hell you want.
My daughter was really upset with me when I bought a bottle of Scotch for Declan. And I told her that I would probably crack it with him when he was 16 or 15. And she got really mad at me. Why wouldn't you wait till he's 21? And I said, because you waited so long to have a kid, I might not be here when he's 21.
And you don't want to miss that, Scott.
I don't want to miss having that opportunity to share a Scotch with my grandson. No, of course not. So
That's cool.
Katie, you raised an interesting point. If 18 has an umami flavor, which is true, I don't point it out because there's a real argument about what umami really is. The allspice like Worcestershire vibe, that's intriguing because I would not have picked it up that way. Maybe you can unmute yourself and explain that to me.
You're getting busted by the Scotch police, Katie.
No, she's not. I'm intrigued by her picking up that flavor. I'm just curious how that transpired in her, like how, because I have had people point things out to me in a Scotch and I'll be sitting there and I'll be like, okay, I get why you think that, because here's the components of the flavor that you're picking up. It's not that flavor, but those are the components that you're picking up. Because that's part of something I forgot to say to everybody. Taste and flavor is very individual. There's no right or wrong when someone does something. Anyways, Katie, can you talk to me?
This is the other Katie, it's Jason.
Oh, Jay.
Hey.
Thank you, Jay. Everybody, Jay's going to talk to me.
Hey, I'm here. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of definitely picking up the allspice. I mean, it's definitely a very prominent first impression. I mean, very, very nice. I mean, definitely unique texture to it. I mean, it just kind of introduces the impression it's going to be a very silky Scotch, right? Which is really nice. But yeah, I mean, it kind of hits me as well with just a little bit of that Worcester just on the front. So if you just kind of, even not even good quality Worcestershire, but or even brand name, whatever, you'll catch it on the front.
That's intriguing. So you got it right on the front tone.
Yeah, minus the vinegariness. Like the vinegariness is very, very
Thank
downplayed.
you.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Now,
So, yeah.
thank you for explaining that, because now I'm going to try that, because that's probably something that is in there that I didn't pick up. Thank you, Jay. That's intriguing. You're right. The front tone of Worcestershire sauce.
It's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then that kind of connects your mind to all of these umami flavors too at the same time. So obviously there's nothing going to be directly umami in there, but I think it's just an impression.
No, that's a very good point, because umami is linked to the front end taste of Worcestershire. So thank you for pointing that out, because I would not have picked that up.
Yeah, Katie kind of mentioned it too, so I was like, okay, I guess I'm not the only one. Great selection though, by the way.
Thank you. I was trying to find a good selection to do an advanced class on.
Are we thinking about making this a regular thing? Because I might be interested in some.